What's up, everybody? Sanity's off the fucking table. Chapter 5. Subscribe, like, comment, share if you dare, and care. Algorithm do not care, but I do. Alright, let's get into Chapter 5. Hopefully you've seen the other video so you're not confused. Alright. Here is an expansion of a new chapter, which is Chapter 5, The World as a Wound, that analyzes World War I and World War II with the same astrological rigor and literary gravitas as the preceding chapters. This chapter situates the two global conflicts within the treaty's overarching theses that the American polity, born under a signature of irreconcilable tension, achieved global hegemony through successive waves of chaos transit, each war serving as both a ritual of national consolidation and a deepening of the structural derangement that would culminate in the contemporary unraveling. Alrighty. Chapter 5. The World is Wound. WW1, WW2, and the Birth of the American Century. If this Orion's birthmark is a constitutional wound, then the two world wars of the 20th century were the wound's expansion to planetary scale. The U.S. entered these conflicts as a peripheral republic and emerged as the undisputed architect of a new global order, an imperium that promised freedom while enforcing hierarchy, that spoke the language of democracy while building the machinery of permanent war. This transformation was not merely political or economic, it was astrologically scripted, encoded in the transits that activated the civilly chart's deepest tensions and propelled the nation into a role for which its natal configuration had prepared it from the beginning. In this chapter, this video traces the astrological architecture of the two world wars, focusing on the outer planet synods that defined each era and on the specific transits that triggered American entry, mobilization, and post-war reconfiguration. We will see that WW1 was the birth of the modern chaos transit, the moment when the U.S. first experienced the full force of a Pluto-Uranus opposition, while its own chart was simultaneously activated by a Saturn-Neptune square. World War II was a repetition and intensification of that pattern, a Saturn-Pluto conjunction in the sign of the home, Cancer, that forced the nation to choose between isolation and empire, and a Neptune transit that dissolved the boundary between righteous war and atomic apocalypse. Together, these were constituted the ritual sacrifice by which the U.S. assumed the mantle of global sovereignty, and by which it inherited a shadow that would eventually demand repayment in the form of the chaos transits examined in earlier chapters. So here's the prelude, which is 1914 and the fracture of the Old World. Beginning with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand on June 28, 1914, triggering a cascade of alliances that plunged Europe into war, but the astrological preconditions for the conflict had been building for years. The outer planets in the early 1910s formed a configuration of unprecedented tension. As we can see, we had Pluto in Gemini. Pluto's transit through the sign of communication, transportation, and information corresponded to the proliferation of telegraph networks, railway timetables, and mass print media, technologies that made industrialized war possible. Pluto and Gemini also rules the twins, and the war would be defined by alliances, dual monarchies, and the splitting of Europe into opposing blocs. As well, Neptune was in Cancer, and Neptune was in the sign of the home, the homeland, and ancestral roots dissolving boundaries between nations while simultaneously inflaming nationalist sentiment. The Heimat became a mystical abstraction for which millions would sacrifice themselves. Uranus in Aquarius. Uranus in its domicile of Aquarius is the planet of revolutionary rupture applying to the collective. The years 1912 through 1914 saw the Balkan Wars, the rise of labor militancy, and the technological acceleration of military aviation, submarines, and chemical weapons. Uranus and Aquarius promise a war that would be unlike any previous conflict, a war of masses, machines, and ideologies, very important with Aquarius. Saturn and Gemini. Saturn's ingress into Gemini in 1913 placed the planet of structure and limitation in the sign of communication at the exact moment when the communication networks of Europe were being strained to the breaking point. The July crisis of 1914 was a failure of diplomacy, a Saturn-Gemini pathology in which rigid alliances and ultimatums replaced negotiation. All right. So the war that erupted was not merely a political catastrophe, it was an astrological necessity, the discharge of decades of accumulated outer planet tension. The U.S., however, initially remained on the periphery. President Woodrow Wilson declared neutrality on August 4, 1914, and the nation settled into a posture of non-intervention that would last nearly 3 years. All right, the U.S. enters the war. Transits of 1917. The American entry into WW1 on April 6, 1917, was triggered by a precise alignment of transit to the Sibley chart. The outer planet configuration of 1917 was a mirror of the pre-war tensions, but now focused directly on the U.S. ascendant and moon. We look at the transit configuration, which is we had Pluto in Cancer. By 1917, Pluto had moved into Cancer, the sign of the home and the foundation. Pluto in Cancer digs up ancestral traumas and forces a confrontation with what has been buried. For the U.S., Pluto in Cancer activated the nation's own foundational wound, the displacement of indigenous peoples, the legacy of slavery, the unresolved tensions of a republic built on contradiction. The decision to enter a European war was the decision to project that wound outward, to externalize the domestic shadow onto the stage of global conflict. Right, Uranus in Aquarius was exactly opposite the U.S. moon in Aquarius, 12 degrees, throughout 1917. Uranus opposite moon is the transitive collective shock, the sudden rupture of the emotional status quo. The American public, which had been resolutely isolationist, was galvanized by German submarine warfare and the intercepted Zimmermann telegram. The opposition shattered the national mood and propelled the country toward war. Neptune in Leo was squaring the U.S. ascendant 19 degrees Scorpio and opposing the U.S. Saturn in Aquarius. Neptune in Leo, the planet of illusion and the sign of leadership and spectacle, produced a war narrative of heroic idealism. Wilson's rhetoric of making the world safe for democracy was a Neptunian mirage, a sacred myth that obscured the economic motives and imperial ambitions that also drove American intervention. And Saturn in Leo was conjoined Neptune in Leo at the moment of entry, forming a Saturn-Neptune conjunction exact October 1917 that would structure the American experience of the war. Saturn-Neptune conjunctions are transits of disillusionment. They promise a sacred mission and then deliver the bureaucratic machinery of death. The American expeditionary forces would arrive in France just as the war entered its final grinding phase, and the idealism of 1917 would curdle into the cynicism of the 1920s. All right, the revelation. American entry into WW1 was the nation's first full immersion in the chaos transit that would define its 20th century identity. The war was not a deviation from American principles, but their export, the application of Virgo and purity rhetoric, making the world safe, cleansing the old world of its corruption to a theater of industrial slaughter. The Sibley chart's square between the Scorpio ascendant and Aquarius moon played out on a global scale. The nation projected its own inner conflict between power, Scorpio, and ideology, Aquarius, onto the European stage, and in doing so, it acquired the instruments of empire. A standing army, a permanent intelligence apparatus, a global economic footprint that would define the American century. Right, the interwar period, the wound that did not heal, the decade and a half between the wars, was not a return to normalcy, but a latency period during which the astrological seeds of the next conflict were sown. So the U.S., having rejected Wilson's League of Nations, retreated into isolationism, but the transits continued to work on its chart. Pluto in Cancer remained throughout the 1920s, digging up the foundations of the American economy. The speculative boom of the 1920s was the Plutonian inflation, a feverish expansion built on debt and illusion that would collapse in 1929. Neptune in Leo gave the 1920s their glamour and their rot, the Hollywood star system, the flappers, the alcohol-fueled hedonism that masked the exhaustion of the war generation. Uranus in Pisces, and then Uranus in Aries, activated the U.S. 4th and 5th houses, producing the cultural upheavals of the Jazz Age and then the economic collapse of the Great Depression. The 1929 crash and the ensuing depression were examined in Chapter 3 as disaster rituals, but for the purposes of this chapter, the interwar period is significant as the gestation of the transits that would produce WW2. The Saturn-Pluto opposition of 1931 through 32, Saturn in Capricorn opposite Pluto in Cancer, signaled the breakdown of the international order. The rise of fascism in Europe and militarism in Japan were the political manifestations of this opposition, which pitted the forces of structural authority, Saturn Capricorn, against the forces of foundational disruption, Pluto Cancer. Alright, let's talk about WW2. Mainly the Saturn-Pluto conjunction in Cancer. So if WW1 was the birth of the American century, WW2 was its coronation. The war that began in Europe in 1939 and engulfed the U.S. in 1941 was framed by a transit of extraordinary power. The Saturn-Pluto conjunction in Cancer, exact from 1939 through 1940, followed by a Neptune-Uranus sextile from 1940 through 42, that configured the alliance system and the technological character of the war. So, Saturn and Pluto conjoined at 0 through 5 degrees Cancer from late 1939 through mid-1940. This was the same sign in which Pluto had been transiting since 1914, and the conjunction represented the crystallization of the Plutonian forces that had been brewing for a generation. Saturn in Cancer is a planet of structure applied to the home, the family, the homeland. It builds walls, enforces borders, and defends the hearth. Pluto in Cancer is the planet of death and rebirth applied to the foundation. It exhumes ancestral trauma and forces a confrontation with the past. So we see that the conjunction in Cancer produced a war, this war, as a conflict of homelands. Nazi Germany's ideology of Lebensraum, living space, with a Saturn-Pluto Cancer pathology, the perversion of the instinct for home into a program of conquest and extermination. The British finest hour was the Saturn-Pluto defense of the island home against the invading force. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was an assault on the American homeland, the moment when the Saturn-Pluto conjunction directly activated the U.S. chart. So, the transit of Pearl Harbor occurred December 7th, 1941. Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor occurred with Saturn at 21 degrees Taurus, exactly opposite the U.S. 4th house cusp, the foundation of the home, as well as Pluto at 4 degrees Leo, conjunct the U.S. 5th house cusp of national creativity and children, now turned to war. As well as Uranus at 27 degrees Taurus, opposite the U.S. 10th house of public reputation, shattering the isolationist consensus, and Neptune at 29 degrees Virgo, squaring the U.S. ascendant from the 6th house of service and sacrifice. So the attack was a rupture, the moment when the Saturn-Pluto conjunction in Cancer finally broke through the American barrier of non-intervention. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt delivered his Day of Infamy speech, and the nation entered the war with the unity it had never before achieved. All right, let's talk about the Neptune-Uranus sextile. So throughout the war's early years, Neptune in Virgo and Uranus in Taurus were forming a sextile, a harmonious aspect that facilitated the mobilization of resources, the development of new technologies, the atomic bomb, radar, jet aircraft, and the formation of the Allied coalition. Neptune in Virgo, the sign of service and purification, gave the war its ideological framing. The struggle against fascism was a holy war, a crusade to cleanse the world of evil. Uranus in Taurus, the sign of material resources, enabled the industrial mobilization that made the United States the arsenal of democracy. The sextile between these two planets meant that the war's technological and ideological dimensions reinforced each other. The U.S. could believe itself a liberator while simultaneously developing the weapons of mass destruction that would define the post-war order. The American chart at war. Transits to the Sibley chart. The American experience of WW2 was structured by transits to the Sibley chart's key points. We see Pluto in Leo. Pluto's ingress into Leo in 1939 placed the planet of power in the sign of leadership, creativity, and the sovereign self. The war made the U.S. the undisputed leader of the Western world, a Plutonian ascension that would shape the nation's self-image for generations. Leo is also the sign of the father, the patriarch, and the war produced a generation of leaders, Roosevelt, Eisenhower, MacArthur, who embodied the archetype of the father protector. Neptune in Libra. Neptune's entry into Libra in 1943 coincided with the peak of American involvement in the war and the beginning of planning for the post-war order. Libra is a sign of treaties, alliances, and international law. Neptune in Libra produced the idealistic framework of the United Nations, the Bretton Woods institutions, and the Marshall Plan, a Neptunian vision of a peaceful, interconnected world that would be perpetually undermined by the plutonian realities of the Cold War. In Uranus in Gemini, entered in 1942, the sign of communication, information, and transportation. Uranus Gemini transit produced a proliferation of mass media, radio, newsreels, propaganda, the mobility of the wartime population, and the beginning of the information age. It also squared the U.S. moon in Aquarius throughout the war, maintaining the emotional tension that kept the nation mobilized for total war. Let's talk about the atomic sacrifice here. August 1945, the war ended with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and 9th, 1945. The transits of that month are a final devastating signature. Saturn in Cancer was in the same sign as the Saturn-Pluto conjunction that had begun the war, now transiting the U.S. 7th house of open enemies and opposing the U.S. 1st house ascendant. The enemy had been defeated, but the Saturn-Cancer transit demanded a sacrifice to the home, a ritual payment for the victory. Pluto in Leo. Pluto was trining the U.S. ascendant from Leo, a harmonious aspect that gave the U.S. the power to reshape the world in its image. But the atomic bomb was not a harmonious instrument. It was a Plutonian revelation of the nation's capacity for annihilation. Uranus in Gemini was exactly square the U.S. moon in Aquarius at the time of the bombings, a transit of collective shock that would permanently alter the national psyche. The U.S. had become the only nation to use nuclear weapons in war, and the square ensured that this fact would remain an unassimilated trauma, a wound that could not be healed. The atomic bomb was the culmination of the Neptune-Uranus sextile that had begun in 1940, the fusion of technology, Uranus, and ideology, Neptune, into a weapon that made the U.S. simultaneously the world's savior and its existential threat. The bomb was the ritual sacrifice that ended the war, but it was also the birth of the permanent arms race, the Cold War, and the national security state that would define the American century. The aftermath. The American century is transit. The post-war order was an astrological structure as well, as much as a political one. The U.S. emerged from WWT with its Sibley chart activated in ways that would determine the next 7 decades. Evan slept in like 5 days. Pluto and Leo gave the nation its era of unchallenged global leadership, but also the seeds of the imperial overreach that would manifest in Vietnam and the Middle East. Neptune and Libra gave the nation its idealistic self-image as the defender of democracy and human rights, an image that would become increasingly difficult to reconcile with the realities of CIA coups, nuclear brinkmanship, and racial segregation at home. Uranus and Gemini gave the nation the mass media infrastructure that would shape its collective consciousness, but also the fragmentation of the public sphere that would accelerate in subsequent decades. Saturn and Virgo, at the war's end, began the process of restructuring domestic life, the GI Bill, suburbanization, the baby boom that would create the illusion of a stable, homogeneous American dream, even as the foundations were already cracking. Right. The 2 world wars, viewed through the lens of the Sibley chart, were not aberrations but culminations, the fulfillment of the nation's natal promise of global power, purchased at the price of permanent structural derangement. The wars gave the U.S. the sovereignty of the world, but they also deepened the wound that the preceding chapters have traced. The irreconcilable split between the nation's public self-image, the Virgoan South Node of purity and service, and its secret reality, the Scorpio ascendant of power, secrecy, and death. All right. Oops. There we go. All right, let's conclude with the wars as prologue. The transits that produce WW1 and 2 established a template for the chaos transits examined in earlier chapters. The Pluto returns, the Saturn-Uranus squares, the Neptune emergence that would define the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The U.S. entered the 1910s as a peripheral power and emerged from the 1940s as the world's sole superpower. But that ascension was not a story of progress, it was a story of accumulated shadow. Each war required a suspension of constitutional norms, the expansion of state secrecy, the projection of force beyond borders, and the sacrifice of American bodies to a global mission. Each war deepened the dissociation between what the nation believed itself to be and what it actually was, and each war laid the groundwork for the crises that would follow, the assassinations, the protests, the imperial collapses, the domestic unravelings that have brought us to the current moment, where sanity is off the table and the wound can no longer be contained. The world wars in this reading are not historical events to be mourned or celebrated. They are astrological necessities, the ritual sacrifices by which the American Imperium was born, and the transits that govern them are the same transits that govern our present. Pluto returning to its natal place, Saturn squaring Uranus, Neptune dissolving the boundaries of reality. The difference is that the nation that once protected its shadow outward onto foreign battlefields is now being forced to confront that shadow at home. The world as wound has become the nation as wound, and the ritual sacrifices of the 21st century will not be fought in Europe or the Pacific, but in the streets, the institutions, and the souls of the American polity. Thank you for watching this video, and I will see you in Chapter 5. Right? Nope, Chapter 6. We'll see you in Chapter 6. With peace and love.